Hey there. Tonight, we're tracing the journey of something small. Something that never should have mattered. It didn't sing, it didn't bleed, it didn't pray. It was just a piece of metal. Round, cold, and harmless. Until it wasn't. You've seen one before, a coin. Shiny, simple, and deceptively innocent. You drop it, you lose it, you forget it. But once, in a world built on promises and paranoia, one coin changed everything. The year was 1337. Europe, that restless collection of crowns and grudges, was perched uneasily between prosperity and panic. The Crusades were fading, plague was still a rumor from the east, and every kingdom was pretending to be richer than it really was. Gold glittered in every royal hall, but it was borrowed glitter, credit, not coin. And at the center of it all sat a single piece of gold known as the florin, a coin minted in Florence nearly a century earlier. It was beautiful in its simplicity. A golden lily on one side, St. John the Baptist on the other, as if piety and profit could live peacefully back to back. It became the standard of Europe, the measure of trust between kings. But trust, like gold, wears thin with use. England's King Edward III had a problem. He wanted to rule France. He believed he had a claim, a long, winding genealogical mess of marriages and oaths, but belief alone doesn't buy armies. Wars, like everything else in the 14th century, had to be financed. And so Edward went to the bankers of Florence, the Bardi and Peruzzi families, men whose wealth stretched further than any king's courage. They lent him a fortune, measured not in numbers but in weight, hundreds of thousands of florins. They trusted him because gold was supposed to be eternal, and kings were supposed to keep their word. But eternity, as it turns out, has a short attention span. Edward's war began badly. Sieges dragged on. Mercenaries wanted payment. Ships sank. Supplies rotted. And in 1340, when the bankers came calling for their florins, Edward had none to give. He didn't default with words. Kings didn't apologize. He defaulted with silence. The Florentine bankers, realizing the crown had turned to dust in their hands, panicked. Their ledgers collapsed. Their coin reserves vanished. And within a year, both the Bardi and Peruzzi families were ruined, the mightiest financiers in Europe, undone by one unpaid royal debt. The coin that had bound Europe together, that tiny golden promise, had just snapped. In Florence, merchants whispered that the English king had cursed them. In England, nobles muttered that the Italians had been greedy. But in truth, both were right. Greed is a mirror, it reflects whatever you're standing too close to. The ripple spread. Trade contracts failed. Silk shipments stopped. Venetian traders hoarded silver. And in France, Philip VI, Edward's rival and distant cousin, saw opportunity glimmering through the smoke. He confiscated the remaining Florentine gold in his kingdom, claiming it as divine retribution. "If England cannot pay its debts," he said, "then France shall collect them in battle." It was the perfect excuse. By the time Edward received word, his pride was already bruised. France had mocked his honor. His bankers had fallen. His merchants were restless. And in a world where dignity weighed more than grain, there was only one way to restore balance: war. A war that would last not a year or a decade, but a century. Historians call it the 100 Years' War, as if that title alone could contain its sprawl. Generations born and buried under banners, fields turned to graves, and languages reshaped by conflict. But its seed wasn't a battle cry. It wasn't even a betrayal. It was a coin, a single golden disc that slipped through too many fingers. It's strange how often history starts with money and ends with blood. The first casualties weren't soldiers. They were clerks, merchants, men who counted and recorded rather than fought. In the panic of collapsing credit, letters of trade were burned to erase evidence of debt. Fortunes vanished overnight. Churches filled with men praying for their ledgers to balance. But gold, once faith leaves it, turns into metal again. Heavy, unfeeling, and cold. In the markets of Bruges and Genoa, florins were suddenly worth less than they'd ever been. Not because the gold had changed, but because belief had. Value, after all, is just confidence in disguise. And confidence, once lost, is harder to resurrect than any corpse. As the economy cracked, Europe's monarchs turned inward. Taxation became desperation. Debasement followed. Kings melted coins, mixed gold with baser metals, and prayed no one would notice. But people always notice. Trust rusts fast. The peasants began to grumble. The merchants began to plot. And the popes, well, they did what popes always do in a crisis. Declared it divine will. They said the cold summers, the strange eclipses, the failed harvests. All of it was punishment for greed, which, in a way, was true. But the punishment didn't fall on the greedy. It fell on everyone else. So the stage was set. One king without gold. One coin without trust. One continent too proud to admit it was broke. And somewhere, beneath the weight of banners and blessings, the earth trembled, not from prophecy, but from the slow, deliberate footsteps of armies gathering. The first war of modern finance was about to begin. And it all started because a king couldn't pay his bill. It began with banners. That's how medieval wars liked to announce themselves. Bright flags waving over muddy fields, music that was mostly noise, and declarations read aloud to peasants who didn't care. The parchment said honor, but the soldiers heard hunger. Edward III, England's self-proclaimed heir to France, needed his war to look righteous. The debt was an embarrassment, and no king wants to go down in history as bankrupt. So he rebranded insolvency as destiny. He told his court that the French crown rightfully belonged to him through his mother, Isabella, the she-wolf of France. It was an elegant lie, which is the best kind. After all, nothing stirs loyalty like the promise of stolen property. In the Royal Mint at Westminster, goldsmiths began to melt what little remained of England's reserves. The furnaces roared day and night, turning faith into coin. The new currency bore Edward's profile: sharp nose, steady eyes, an expression of someone who never intended to repay a loan. Across the sea, King Philip VI of France did the same. The economy had collapsed, but pride still minted well. Soon, ships crowded the channel, some laden with troops, others with borrowed courage. And in the summer of 1337, English banners unfurled over the ports of Flanders. That was the sound of credit turning into cannon. If you stood on the docks, you'd have seen it. A painter's nightmare of contradictions. Monks blessing weapons. Merchants pricing rations. Knights praying, not for victory, but for reimbursement. War was expensive, and faith was its only collateral. The first skirmishes were nothing noble. Raids on trade routes, villages set ablaze, small towns learning the true meaning of collateral damage. Armies moved less like thunder and more like locusts, slow, inevitable, devouring everything in their path. Back in Florence, where the coin had first been minted, the bankers watched their city unravel. Without repayment from England, the great families turned on one another. Credit collapsed like a lung. Debtors' prisons filled with men who once owned half of Europe. The florin, once a symbol of trust, now carried a curse. A single coin had become radioactive. Whoever touched it too long began to decay. Florentine goldsmiths melted down what remained of their florins and recast them as jewelry, symbols of luxury rather than currency. You could wear your ruin, but you couldn't spend it. Meanwhile, on the battlefields of France, the war refused to die. Every victory demanded another. Every treaty was written in invisible ink. The English took towns they couldn't hold. The French reclaimed fields they couldn't defend. It became a rhythm, a heartbeat of destruction. And beneath it all, the coin kept turning. Mercenaries demanded payment in gold, not promises. Quartermasters cheated soldiers, soldiers robbed peasants, peasants turned bandit, and everyone blamed someone richer. The economy of suffering ran more efficiently than any bank ever had. In Paris, King Philip introduced new taxes on bread, on wine, on salt. He called them temporary, which every ruler says before dying. The taxes never left. They simply changed names as centuries passed, ghosts of necessity dressed up as tradition. You could almost call it progress. By 1346, the English found themselves at Crécy, facing a French army twice their size. The chroniclers wrote that the sky darkened as the battle began. A fitting metaphor, though in truth it was only a summer storm. Rain soaked the longbows. Mud swallowed the dead. When the clouds finally cleared, 10,000 men lay scattered across the field, and the air smelled of iron and rain. The English won, barely. They called it divine favor. The French called it weather. Both were right. That victory should have ended the war, but money has its own inertia. Edward's coffers were empty again, and glory doesn't pay bills. He began minting new coins from captured silver, foreign metal stamped with English pride. Each coin glittered like proof that conquest worked. Each one carried the same quiet lie that had started it all. That value could be created by force. Historians later said the war was about dynastic claims, feudal rights, and national identity. Those are just prettier words for debt collection, because behind every arrow, every sword, every sermon about honor, there was always a ledger. The Florentines never recovered. Their banking collapse rippled outward, bankrupting smaller merchants from Bruges to Barcelona. Trade slowed to a crawl. Gold hoarded in one kingdom meant famine in another. Ships rotted at anchor, guilds dissolved, and still kings borrowed, promising futures they didn't own. It was a loop of illusion, everyone pretending someone else had the money. And through it all, people clung to faith. Priests preached patience. Astrologers blamed the stars. Farmers planted, harvested, and starved in rotation. The common people didn't need economics to explain suffering. They had sin for that. But sin was easier to confess than interest. The century that followed would see plagues, revolts, and kingdoms devouring themselves. Yet the thread ran unbroken, from that single unpaid coin to the endless wars it financed by accident. Edward died convinced he'd restored his honor. His son inherited the crown and the debt, along with a war that refused to end. France burned, England bled, and the bankers of Florence faded into legend. You could trace every headline of the century, every rebellion, every famine, every empty treasury, back to that first moment of arrogance when a king looked at gold and saw eternity. Coins, after all, don't age. People do. The florins survived long after the men who betrayed it were dust. It passed through hands that had no idea they were holding a curse, traded across markets that forgot why it gleamed the way it did. But every so often, when famine returned or a treaty collapsed, someone would find an old Florentine coin in a chest and wonder aloud if gold itself carried memory. It did, because gold, unlike history, never forgets what it was traded for. When Florence fell, it didn't make a sound loud enough to echo across the world. There were no collapsing towers, no smoking ruins, no desperate songs of exile. It died quietly, like a candle guttering in a cathedral too vast to notice the dark. But the silence spread. By 1340, the great banking houses of Florence, Bardi, Peruzzi, and Acciaiuoli, had crumbled. Their ledgers were tombs, their vaults full of promises that no longer meant anything. For centuries, Florence had been the nervous system of Europe's economy, pumping gold and credit through the arteries of kingdoms. When it failed, the body convulsed. Trade froze. Loans vanished. A merchant in Bruges couldn't pay a weaver in Ghent because his account in Florence was gone. A knight in Gascony couldn't sell his grain because no one had coin left to buy it. Farmers buried their silver rather than spend it. Trust, that invisible glue that held civilization together, had melted away like wax in the sun. And all because a king refused to pay for his war. The collapse was more than financial. It was spiritual. Medieval Europe believed money was moral, that wealth reflected God's favor, and ruin meant sin. Florence, the city of art, science, and saints, suddenly looked damned. Priests preached sermons about greed in the piazzas. Goldsmiths melted crosses to pay debts. The city that had once minted the florin now bartered in bread. Some said it was divine punishment. Others whispered that the bankers had made a deal with the devil and lost. But most people didn't bother with reasons. They were too busy surviving. Meanwhile, the Florentine merchants who fled north carried their knowledge with them: how to calculate interest, how to track credit, how to turn faith into finance. They rebuilt quietly in other cities. In Venice, Bruges, and eventually London. The virus of banking, once thought dead, found new hosts. Every empire has its contagion. Florence's was money. Back in England, Edward III treated the ruin of his lenders as an act of providence. Their greed destroyed them, he told his council. It was easier to say that than admit he'd broken them himself. He minted new gold coins, stamped with his face and a Latin prayer. "The Lord is my helper," they read. It was not irony, it was insurance. Across the Channel, Philip VI of France called the same collapse God's justice upon usurers. He confiscated the Florentines' remaining assets in France, claiming them as royal property. In truth, he just needed the gold for his own armies. It's a pattern that never really dies. When kings run out of money, they blame the bankers, and when bankers run out of money, they blame God. By 1347, Europe was bruised but functioning again. The economy limped forward, the war between England and France still grinding in slow motion. Skirmishes burned across the countryside like brush fires, harmless to kings, fatal to peasants. The soldiers grew younger, the fields emptier. It had become less a war of conquest and more a habit that no one knew how to break. And then came the plague. No one expected the Black Death to care about politics, but it did in its own quiet way. It followed the same trade routes that money once had, traveling from port to port like a grim accountant checking the books. The disease didn't discriminate between rich and poor, but it did change what they feared. Before, the worst thing a man could lose was his coin. Now it was his breath. In Florence, where famine had already hollowed the city, the plague finished what debt had begun. The same narrow streets that once echoed with the clatter of commerce now rang with bells for the dead. Coffins became currency. The smell of incense and rot was everywhere. And yet, even in the middle of apocalypse, the idea of money refused to die. Merchants still traded. Masks, candles, burial shrouds. Priests charged for last rites. The economy of death replaced the economy of life, and in some ways it worked better. When the plague finally withdrew, Europe was a different place. Labor was scarce, food was cheap, and money had changed hands. Peasants who had once been invisible now held bargaining power. The nobility, reduced in number and wealth, turned crueler to compensate. And somewhere in all that quiet chaos, the spark of a new idea began to smolder. Maybe gold wasn't divine after all. Maybe it was just useful. That's the irony of history. Belief collapses faster than economies, but it also rebuilds faster. Within a generation, new banks rose. New kings borrowed. The florin was replaced by the ducat, and then the noble, each promising to be more stable, more trustworthy, more eternal than the last. Of course, they weren't. The war between England and France still raged. The names on the banners changed, But the logic stayed the same: land, pride, revenge, and money. Always money. Every truce contained a payment. Every alliance was a transaction. Every betrayal was a debt coming due. A coin had started the first act, but now the war had learned to sustain itself. It no longer needed reasons, just momentum. In Paris, chroniclers began to describe the sky as heavy. They didn't mean weather. They meant the weight of exhaustion. Entire generations were born into a conflict that had no clear beginning or end. They called it the war, as if there had never been a time without it. And through it all, the coin remained, passed from hand to hand, traded, hoarded, melted, reminted. It existed in hundreds of shapes now, but the curse was the same. Each new mint carried a trace of that original betrayal, the moment when gold stopped representing faith and started replacing it. There's a strange poetry in that. One king defaulted and Europe discovered credit. One city collapsed and Europe invented capitalism. Every disaster leaves behind a blueprint for the next age. Florence would recover, of course. It always did. By the next century, it would become the heart of the Renaissance. A city built on beauty, intellect, and quietly the memory of failure. Behind every statue, every fresco, every dome of gold leaf, there was a ghost of a ledger. But for now, in the mid-14th century, Europe was still shivering in the shadow of its own greed. Armies marched on mud roads. Kings dreamed of crowns they couldn't afford. And the people below them did what people always do: they endured. The war went on, patient as hunger. And somewhere, in the ruins of an old Florentine mint, a single cracked coin lay buried in the dust. Its edges worn, its inscription faded, its silence absolute. It had no idea it had started all this. By the middle of the 14th century, Europe had begun to forget what peace felt like. It wasn't that war had consumed everything. It was that it had become ordinary. Farmers sowed crops beside battlefields. Merchants calculated profits between sieges, and children grew up knowing more about taxes than about safety. The kings still called it honor. The soldiers called it work. Everyone else called it expensive. England and France were both exhausted, though neither could admit it. Their wars were like debts, too vast to pay off, too dangerous to cancel. Each new king inherited the same burden, an account that could never balance. And for the people beneath them, that burden had a name: taxation. Money was the bloodstream of the war, and the peasants were its veins. In England, collectors arrived at every village with scrolls and seals, bearing royal insignias that no one dared question. The coins they demanded were smaller now, thinner, duller. The mintmasters had mixed copper into the silver, a quiet fraud that everyone knew about, but no one could stop. When the villagers protested, the collectors told them to pray harder. God apparently was also short on funds. Some peasants tried to cheat the system. They buried their coins, or melted them into jewelry, or pretended their crops had failed. Others grew cleverer still. They stopped paying entirely. A few villages simply vanished into the forests, forming small, self-sufficient bands that lived beyond the reach of kings and priests. They called themselves free men, though the forests were as cold as they were free. Every rebellion begins as a whisper, and in the 1350s that whisper began to spread. Meanwhile, in France, the war had turned into theater. The nobility still rode into battle dressed like peacocks. Embroidered tunics, polished armor, plumes fluttering in the wind. But the glory was gone. The English longbows cut through their pageantry like paper. Defeat had become a tradition. To pay for their losses, the French crown demanded more from its people: grain, livestock, labor. And when the peasants couldn't give, they were punished for disobedience. Entire villages were burned for unpaid taxes. Crops trampled. Livestock seized. It was the kind of justice that made loyalty look optional. In 1358, in the valley of the Oise, that loyalty finally snapped. The peasants of northern France rose up, calling themselves the Jacquerie, a name that sounded almost polite until the killing began. They armed themselves with scythes, hammers, and fury, storming the manors of their lords. For a few weeks, the old order trembled. Chroniclers described the uprising as madness, but it wasn't madness, it was math. When enough people owe what they cannot pay, rebellion becomes arithmetic. The nobles crushed the revolt, of course. They always did. The survivors were hunted down, hanged, or mutilated as examples. The priests said justice had been restored, but something irreversible had shifted. Faith, once unshakable, had begun to crack. You could hear it in sermons that no longer promised salvation but warned of judgment. You could see it in the eyes of villagers, who stopped looking to heaven for mercy and began looking at each other for survival. The old compact between ruler and subject, between man and God, had quietly dissolved. The Black Death had already made everyone suspicious of divine fairness. Now the endless war finished the job. If God truly blessed kings, why did kings need taxes? If the church held power over souls, why did its priests eat better than its poor? These weren't heresies yet. They were just questions, the kind that keep entire civilizations up at night. And the coin? It was still there, humming beneath the surface like a curse. In Florence, where the economy had once collapsed, the children of ruined bankers had found new trades. Some became artists, others politicians. But they all carried the same lesson: that money and morality were different languages pretending to say the same thing. Florence was rebuilding itself, slowly, as a city of ambition rather than faith. Elsewhere, mercenaries ruled. Disbanded soldiers, unemployed knights, and opportunists formed free companies. Bands of armed men who sold their loyalty to the highest bidder. They fought for France one season, England the next, and for themselves always. Towns paid them to leave as often as to fight. They were walking debts, armed and impatient. You could hear their songs drifting through the countryside. Mocking hymns about kings who couldn't count, priests who couldn't preach, and the fools who died for both. By the 1360s, Europe had begun to eat itself. The 100 Years' War wasn't a single conflict anymore. It was a disease. One kingdom's loss became another's infection. The borders shifted so often that maps grew obsolete before the ink dried. And through all this noise, one quiet truth persisted. No one really knew what they were fighting for. Edward's heirs in England still claimed divine right to France, though even their soldiers had stopped pretending to believe it. The French kings still swore they were defending their homeland, even as they hired foreign mercenaries to do the killing. Every army marched under banners embroidered with saints, and every saint looked equally unimpressed. War had become the only reliable business. Yet even in the chaos, people found rhythm. Markets reopened in the ruins. Artists painted frescoes of peace they'd never seen. Monks copied the same manuscripts, their handwriting growing thinner as the decades passed. Humanity, stubborn as moss, kept growing between the cracks. The war no longer needed kings to sustain it. It had become self-sufficient. Fed on debt, on fear, on tradition. Each generation inherited not just the fight, but the habit of fighting. And somewhere in an old archive in Florence, a clerk writing about grain prices scribbled a note in the margin. The world runs on credit and prayer. Both are in short supply. He wasn't wrong. Every century has its language of obedience. In this one, it was taxes and faith. Pay your due, say your prayers, trust the crown. But both pillars were rotting, and beneath the sermons and coin stamps, the cracks were widening. The kings didn't see it. The priests didn't hear it. But the people did. They always do. The debt had become invisible, but it was still there, whispering in every field, every church, every heart. And soon that whisper would become a scream. By the late 1300s, Europe was tired of being patient. For generations, the people had waited for peace or justice, or at least a decent harvest. They got none of those things. The war dragged on like bad weather, the taxes never stopped, and the church, instead of offering comfort, began selling it. Every kingdom was crumbling from the same quiet infection: exhaustion. It's easy to imagine history as noise, battles, speeches, banners, but most of the time, it's silence. The kind that hums inside a crowded church or hangs over a field where the wheat never ripened. And in that silence, hunger starts to think. The first to speak were the preachers, not the official ones with embroidered robes and Latin in their throats, but the wild ones. Men in rough wool, barefoot, furious, half-mad with faith. They traveled from village to village, crying that the end was near, that the world had grown corrupt beyond repair, that kings were thieves in crowns. They weren't wrong. In England, one of these men, John Ball, preached that all men were born equal, and that the time had come to make it true. His words spread faster than coin. They slipped between thatched roofs and tavern benches, whispered by farmers who had nothing left to lose. Ball said the war was a lie, that it wasn't God's will but the greed of kings. He said, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" A dangerous sentence in a world built on hierarchy. In 1381, that sentence became a rebellion. It started, as these things always do, with a tax, another levy for the endless war in France. This one was a poll tax, meaning everyone paid the same, rich or poor. It sounded fair, which was exactly what made it unbearable. When the collectors came, the peasants refused. The refusals turned into fights, the fights into mobs, the mobs into armies. They carried sticks, pitchforks, and a kind of clarity that frightened even themselves. They called it the Great Rising. The rebels marched on London, their numbers swelling like a tide. They broke open prisons, burned records, and hunted down tax officials. The chroniclers say they were savage, but they were also organized, fueled by decades of quiet humiliation. John Ball was released from his cell to preach in the open air. "Now is the time," he told them, "for the world to be made new." But revolutions, especially medieval ones, have short attention spans. The king, Richard II, a boy of 14, rode out to meet them. He promised reform, lower taxes, fair treatment. The crowd cheered. The moment felt holy, as if the system itself had blinked. Then, within days, the promises dissolved. The rebel leaders were hunted down. John Ball was captured, hanged, drawn, and quartered. His sermons were declared heresy, but the words had already escaped. The rebellion failed, as rebellions usually do. But its failure had a strange afterlife. In the years that followed, you could still hear echoes of it everywhere. In the tavern songs, in the margins of manuscripts, in the eyes of men who refused to kneel quite as deeply. The poor had learned something that couldn't be unlearned. That the system wasn't divine, only human, and therefore breakable. The French had their own version a few decades earlier, the Jacquerie, as brutal as it was brief. In Italy, the Ciompi revolted in Florence, demanding wages from the same families who once minted gold like faith. Even in the monasteries, young monks began to question why silence was holier than justice. It was as if Europe had begun to remember its own reflection. And still, the war went on. By now, it had outlived everyone who started it. The descendants of Edward III and Philip VI fought under the same banners, for reasons no one could clearly explain. The 100 Years' War had become a century-long argument about legitimacy, kept alive by debt and pride. France and England both changed rulers, changed tactics, changed weapons, but not the habit of fighting. The invention of the longbow had already made knights obsolete. Now the invention of gunpowder made chivalry itself redundant. The old world was dying, though it pretended not to notice. Every battle cost a fortune. Every victory was followed by bankruptcy. The same coin that once sparked this fire was still rolling downhill, collecting bodies instead of interest. And somewhere in Florence, a young painter named Giotto sketched angels who looked tired. Meanwhile, the church, supposedly the moral compass of the age, was splitting in half. Two popes, one in Rome and one in Avignon, excommunicated each other in a celestial shouting match. The faithful didn't know which one to believe, so they began to believe less. If heaven couldn't keep its accounts straight, what hope was there for earth? And yet, amid all that confusion, something new began to form. A restlessness, an awareness, the faint beginning of thought. Scholars in Paris started questioning not just kings and priests, but the idea of authority itself. Writers like Chaucer and Christine de Pizan turned mockery into philosophy. Even the merchants, those quiet survivors of every war, began keeping double-entry ledgers, a small miracle of order in a chaotic world. It's easy to miss these shifts because they move slowly. But history isn't built from battles. It's built from realization. And Europe was starting to realize that the world didn't have to be arranged like a pyramid with God at the top and peasants at the bottom. Could be a circle. That idea, of course, was centuries ahead of its time. But every revolution starts as a thought in someone's head who doesn't live long enough to see it bloom. And so, in the ashes of revolt and ruin, in the dust of the very fields where armies had fought and peasants had starved, something invisible was sprouting, seeds of doubt, seeds of reason, seeds that wouldn't flower until the Renaissance. The war hadn't ended. The kings were still counting losses as if they were blessings. The poor were still paying for victories they'd never seen. But the old world, the one built on divine order and blind obedience, had already begun to crack. The coin that started it all was long forgotten, melted, remade, passed through uncounted hands. But its curse lived on, whispering in every mint and marketplace. That value without conscience is just another kind of weapon. And in the decades to come, that weapon would turn inward. Because before Europe could rebuild, it would have to destroy itself again. By the end of the 14th century, Europe had learned to live with war the way a man learns to live with a limp. It wasn't fatal anymore. It was habitual. The cannons fired less from strategy and more from momentum. The soldiers fought for wages rather than glory. Even the kings no longer believed in victory, only in endurance. But belief, like debt, always finds a new body to inhabit. Where kings had once sold honor, the church now sold forgiveness. It was a clever trade. Invisible product, infinite supply. They called it indulgence, an official receipt for absolution. You could sin as deeply as you liked, provided your purse was deep enough to match. For a population traumatized by war, plague, and hunger, this was the perfect business model. Guilt was the only thing Europe had left in abundance. The priests didn't invent greed, they simply sanctified it. Church treasuries swelled with coin, much of it Florentine gold melted and rebranded as divine currency. Pilgrims trudged across frozen fields to hand over their last silver penny, believing they were buying a place in heaven. The irony was exquisite. The same metal that had bankrupted Florence now promised eternal life. And as the church grew richer, its cathedrals reached higher. Stone by stone, Europe built monuments to its own fear. Towers that scraped the sky, vaults that defied gravity, glass that turned sunlight into sermons. Each cathedral was a ledger of anxiety. Every arch an interest payment to God, every bell a reminder of debt. Inside, the frescoes shimmered with gold leaf, heaven painted in currency. Christ wept in gilded robes. Angels fluttered on walls that had been funded by famine. The faithful knelt beneath them, praying with calloused hands, their eyes wide with awe and confusion. Outside, the air smelled of smoke and iron. The 100 Years' War was entering its final act, though no one knew it yet. France, battered but unbroken, was slowly gathering its strength. England, once triumphant, was sinking into political quicksand. Kings died, crowns changed hands, alliances blurred. What began as a war for inheritance had become a war of inheritance, the endless passing down of debt and resentment. By 1415, England found its swagger again under Henry V, a man young enough to believe in miracles and reckless enough to try to make one. His army, hungry and outnumbered, met the French at Agincourt on a rain-soaked field. Mud was the great equalizer. The French knights, heavy with armor, sank like stones. The English longbows sang through the mist. When it was over, thousands of corpses lay twisted in the dirt, blue blood and brown mud mixing into the same color. The chroniclers called it divine favor. The survivors called it luck. Henry claimed the victory as proof that God preferred his rule. The church agreed, for a fee. In return for generous donations, sermons across England announced that the king's triumph was a sign of heaven's will. The pulpit had become propaganda before the word existed. Back in France, the response was spiritual desperation. The French clergy declared that defeat was punishment for national sin. The people nodded. It sounded plausible. But they still had to eat. So they turned to relics, prayers, and rumors. Anything that might make sense of senselessness. And from that despair, a legend was born. Her name was Jean. She came from a small village in Lorraine, a place so unremarkable that even the tax collectors forgot to visit. She said she heard voices, saints, angels, perhaps God himself. They told her France would be saved by her hand. If you lived in that century, you might have believed her. Everyone was waiting for a miracle, and miracles, like gold, tend to appear when logic collapses. Jean, Joan of Arc, wasn't the first to claim divine guidance, but she was the first who meant it. She rode into battle in armor too big for her, carrying a banner instead of a sword. To the soldiers, she was something impossible, a symbol that hadn't been corrupted yet. And for a brief, dazzling moment, it worked. Her presence turned exhaustion into purpose. French troops who had been losing for generations began to win. Cities that had forgotten the meaning of victory opened their gates to her. For England, she was an inconvenience. For France, she was faith in armor. But faith in politics is always short-lived. When the tide turned, she was captured, sold to the English, and handed to the church. They put her on trial for heresy, a word that had begun to mean too much conviction. The irony was unbearable. The same institution that sold forgiveness for coin burned a girl for believing without it. Her death was meant to silence France. Instead, it resurrected it. Within a generation, the war would finally end. Not in triumph, but in exhaustion. The English retreated, their coffers empty once again. France was a graveyard stitched together by pride. The world looked around and realized that a century of slaughter had changed nothing except the shape of its poverty. But underneath the ashes, something was different. The feudal order had cracked. The church was rich but hollow. The kings were powerful but paranoid. The people were poorer than ever, but they had begun to think for themselves. And through it all, money kept flowing, faith's counterfeit twin. Merchants in Florence, Venice, and Genoa were inventing new forms of accounting, new languages for greed. Banking was no longer a sin. It was a science. Artists painted saints with the faces of their patrons. Priests commissioned frescoes with the profits of indulgences. God had become an investor, and the church his most successful corporation. The same gold that had toppled Florence now funded the Renaissance. It's a strange kind of redemption, the way suffering turns to splendor when enough time passes. Cathedrals rose from famine, philosophy from failure, art from ashes. Civilization had learned to make beauty out of its debts. But behind the gold leaf, the cracks were still there. People could see them now. A monk in Germany would one day hammer them into a door, and the sound would echo across the world. But that was still a century away. For now, Europe knelt beneath its painted heavens, whispering the same prayer it had whispered since Edward's debt first shattered Florence. Lord, deliver us from the hunger we made ourselves. And if heaven was listening, it remained politely silent. By the dawn of the 15th century, war had burned itself into habit and peace had turned into a rumor. The soldiers went home not because they had won, but because there was nothing left to win. France was rubble stitched together by pride. England was a treasury of debts and empty victories. The fields still stank of gunpowder and prayers, but the real battles had already moved indoors. The war had taught Europe a new gospel, that everything from salvation to sovereignty could be measured in coin. It wasn't divine intervention that rebuilt cities, it was profit. Gold became the quiet successor to God, and its temples were not cathedrals anymore, but counting houses. Florence rose again first, not with armies but with abacuses. The same city that once collapsed under unpaid loans became the capital of calculation. Its streets glittered not with banners, but with balance sheets. The Medici family, bankers with the instincts of kings, began lending to everyone who mattered: popes, princes, merchants, even rival families who pretended to despise them. And slowly, Europe learned to pray differently. The language of faith shifted from Latin to numbers. A merchant's ledger replaced a monk's scroll. Forgiveness came not from confession, but from credit. The coin had completed its evolution from currency to creed. In Florence, the sound of hammers striking gold echoed through alleys like bells. Artists painted Madonnas with eyes that looked suspiciously like their patrons' wives. Sculptors carved saints who smirked faintly, as if they knew who paid for them. Even the churches grew mathematical. Domes designed by geometry, altarpieces balanced by perspective. Beauty became a transaction. Across the Alps, in Germany and the Low Countries, towns discovered a similar alchemy. Printing presses began to click and hum, spitting out indulgence certificates faster than priests could bless them. Each one was stamped, signed, and priced according to the severity of the sin. A small lie, 1 coin. Adultery, 3. Heresy, that depended on your connections. The marketplace of morality was open for business. It was all built on a quiet agreement that heaven could be managed like a treasury, and the soul could be balanced like a ledger. The kings liked this system, so did the popes, kept people obedient. It also kept the lights on. But under the varnish of prosperity, something darker simmered. Because if coin could buy salvation, it could also buy truth. And once truth is for sale, everyone becomes suspicious. The common people, who had endured a century of famine and war, began to notice that the world was rebuilding without them. The cities gleamed, but the villages starved. The same gold that adorned the churches was mined from their hunger. And yet, they couldn't quite bring themselves to rebel again. Not yet. They were tired of rebellion. It never lasted. Instead, they turned inward. The mystics whispered that the divine was not in the church, but in the heart. Poets began writing not about kings and crusades, but about doubt. Painters turned from saints to faces. The Renaissance, beneath its gilded surface, was really just a collective attempt to remember what it meant to be human. Meanwhile, the old institutions clung tighter to their power. The church, now effectively a multinational empire, used coin as both sword and shield. Cathedrals grew more ornate, sermons more theatrical. The spectacle of faith had to match the price of admission. But even faith runs on credit, and credit always expires. By the late 1400s, cracks began to show. The Medici fell, briefly, under the weight of their own magnificence. In Florence, a Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola rose from the pulpits, condemning the city's vanity in a voice that sounded half prophet, half accountant. He called for the bonfire of the vanities, for paintings, jewels, and even books to be burned in the name of purity. The people obeyed. They brought their mirrors, their dresses, their tapestries, and tossed them into the flames. It was a strange moment, half revival, half madness. You could almost hear the echo of that first broken coin in the roar of the fire. Florence was purging itself of wealth again, as if trying to erase the memory of the debt that had cursed it. But purging is just another kind of indulgence, and fire burns faster than faith. When the friar overplayed his hand, accusing the Pope himself of corruption, Rome answered with the same weapon it always used. Savonarola was hanged, then burned, in the same square where his sermons had drawn thousands. The flames consumed him, but not his idea. The world had watched a banker's city briefly turn into a monastery and then back again. The pendulum of greed and guilt kept swinging, and no one knew how to stop it. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Europe, gold was on the move again. The Spanish crowns had begun sponsoring voyages, expensive gambles across impossible oceans. They didn't call them conquests, they called them discoveries. The priests blessed the ships, the kings financed them, and the merchants prayed for whatever was found to be profitable. It was the perfect trinity: God, gold, and glory. The new world that waded across the Atlantic was seen not as land, but as balance. A place to refill the ledgers of a civilization that could no longer afford its own luxury. And in 1492, when Columbus set sail under a sky as dark as old debt, he wasn't really chasing geography, he was chasing solvency. The same greed that had bankrupted Florence and funded cathedrals now pointed its compass west. The coin had become an empire, and the empire was hungry. What began with a debt in 1337 would now become the age of global debt, a system that could stretch across oceans carried by ships instead of prayers. It's easy to say that history moves in circles, but it doesn't. It spirals. Each turn a little wider, a little faster, a little closer to collapse. By the time the Renaissance dawned, Europe had learned how to paint paradise, but not how to live in it. The wars were smaller now, the art grander, the cities richer, but beneath the polish, the same wound festered. That small golden lie that began with one king and one unpaid coin. It had taught humanity a terrible skill: how to turn belief into currency and currency into belief. And as Europe prepared to sail toward new worlds, it carried that skill like a hidden weapon, gleaming, invisible, and undefeated. By the time the 16th century began, Europe had grown restless again. The cathedrals were finished, the frescoes dry, the statues smugly perfect, and yet the hunger that had built them was still gnawing. The cities were rich, but the people were not. The wars had quieted, but the debts had not. Gold had simply changed hands, not hearts. It was in this atmosphere, a mixture of fatigue and ambition, that the horizon itself began to look tempting. The merchants and kings of Europe turned their eyes toward the edge of the map, where rumor met imagination. Out there, they said, were islands made of silver, mountains made of gold, rivers that glittered even at night. Of course, no one believed it completely, but disbelief has never stopped men from building ships. Spain and Portugal were the first to gamble. They had the most to lose and, after a century of religious wars, the most to prove. Their treasuries were thin, their faith thick, and both required replenishment. So they built fleets, floating prayers made of timber and hope, and they sailed west into the unknown, guided by the same invisible compass that had steered kings toward ruin for centuries: the promise of gold. It wasn't courage that drove them, it was credit. When Christopher Columbus petitioned the Spanish crown, he didn't talk about discovery. He talked about return on investment. The expedition would be cheap, he promised. The profits, infinite. He used the same logic bankers once used in Florence. A little debt now, a world of wealth later. It worked as it always does at first. When the ships returned, they carried not mountains of gold but something even more valuable, proof. Proof that there was land across the water, proof that it could be taken, proof that the game could continue. And soon the game devoured the world. Conquistadors followed, Cortés, Pizarro, men who prayed with one hand and plundered with the other. They burned temples, melted idols, and renamed cities. They called it evangelism. They called it civilization. But in the end, it was just an old coin rolling downhill. Faster now, unstoppable. The gold poured into Spain like water into a cracked vessel. Ships returned heavy with treasure, and the streets of Seville glimmered under the weight of it. But gold, like fire, consumes as much as it illuminates. Prices soared. Bread tripled. A farmer's coin was worth half of what it had been the year before. Spain had too much wealth to be rich. The irony was unbearable. They had conquered half the world and bankrupted themselves doing it. Elsewhere, the same pattern repeated. Portugal in Africa, England in India, Holland in the East Indies. Each nation believed it had found the secret Florence never mastered. That wealth could be infinite if you stole it fast enough. But the more gold Europe found, the hungrier it became. The wars returned, dressed in new names. They were no longer fought for honor or thrones, but for trade routes and sugar and ships. The banners were gone. The ledgers remained. Soldiers became employees. Kings became shareholders. The modern world had been born, and its heart beat to the rhythm of debt. The church tried to keep up, of course. It always does. It sanctified conquest, calling it conversion. It blessed fleets, crowned emperors, and quietly invested in the same companies that sent soldiers to die overseas. But beneath its gilded calm, unease was spreading again, because the more people saw of the world, the less they believed in heaven. The explorers returned with maps that contradicted scripture. The scholars began whispering that the earth was not the center of creation after all. The church's monopoly on truth began to fracture, and the cracks widened with every shipment of gold. By 1517, those cracks would shatter entirely when a German monk nailed a few sentences to a church door and accidentally rewrote civilization. Martin Luther's protest was theological on the surface, but financial underneath. He wasn't just angry about sin, he was angry about sales. The indulgence trade, the same business that had once rebuilt Florence's churches, had become a marketplace for absolution. It was all too familiar. He called it corruption, but it was really just capitalism in a cassock. The coin that had once bankrupted kingdoms now bankrupted salvation. When Luther's words spread, they burned faster than any army could move. Printing presses turned outrage into wildfire. The Reformation began, and suddenly Europe was back in the only business it truly understood: division. Protestants and Catholics, princes and peasants, papal bulls and battlefields. The wars of faith replaced the wars of crowns. The fires that once burned in forges now burned in cities. And all of it, every sermon, every slaughter, every reform, was still just the echo of that first unpaid coin. Because money has memory, and memory never forgets interest. The Reformation wasn't just a spiritual crisis. It was an accounting correction. The church had overextended its credit of belief, and the people were finally calling the debt. The century that followed would drown in that reckoning. Wars of religion, mass migrations, witch trials, empires dissolving under their own gold. The age of discovery had become the age of disillusionment. Humanity had found a new world but lost its old one in the process. And still the coin rolled on. Crossed oceans, traded hands, changed empires. Paid for cathedrals, for armies, for revolutions. It gleamed in the pockets of kings and beggars alike. And everywhere it went, it carried the same curse. the belief that possession could mean peace. The Renaissance had promised rebirth, but it had delivered appetite. The Reformation promised purity, but it delivered division. The world, it seemed, had mastered the art of turning salvation into transaction. The florin had become the ducat. The ducat became the doubloon. The doubloon would become the dollar. And each new version carried a little less gold and a little more faith. It's a neat trick, really. Humanity managed to convince itself that paper could replace metal, that promises could replace proof. The miracle of money was no longer that it was made of gold. It was that it no longer needed to be. That's how the story of one coin became the story of all of them. And though the wars would change shape, though the thrones would fall and the popes would fade, the hunger that started it all remained the same. It's still with us. Quieter, cleaner, digital now, but no less devout. The only difference is that today, when the world trembles under the weight of its own debts, we no longer call it judgment. We call it the economy. By the 17th century, the world had officially traded its soul for efficiency. The once sacred metal that launched crusades, built cathedrals, and bankrupted kings was slowly being replaced by something lighter, something more convenient. Paper. It didn't glitter, it didn't clink, and it couldn't be melted into chalices or crowns. But it could travel, multiply, and promise value it didn't yet possess. And that, as it turned out, was far more dangerous. Europe had learned the art of believing in things it couldn't see. First God, then gold, now credit. The banks of Amsterdam and London had become temples of invisible wealth. Merchants no longer needed chests of coin to trade. They needed confidence. Confidence in ink, confidence in signatures, confidence that a promise made today would still be honored tomorrow. It was a miracle of trust, but also a masterpiece of denial. Paper money was the perfect illusion. It allowed everyone to pretend they were richer than they were, so long as they didn't all check at once. And like all miracles, it demanded faith. The Dutch perfected it first. Their empire floated not on gunpowder or piety, but on accounting. They built ships the way Florentines once built cathedrals, expensive, precise, magnificent. Each voyage was a gamble measured in risk and percentage points. Investors didn't pray for success. They prayed for dividends. In 1602, they formalized the process, creating something entirely new. The Verenigd Oostindische Company, the Dutch East India Company. It was the world's first corporation, though they didn't yet have the word for it. They called it a joint stock venture, which sounds almost humble until you realize it could wage wars, sign treaties, and print its own currency. For the first time in history, profit had an army. The company's seal bore a monogram instead of a crown. Its captains carried ledgers instead of royal decrees. It conquered with contracts, not crusades. And the world bent around it. Spices, silk, slaves, sugar, the cargo changed, but the logic didn't. Each ship that left Amsterdam carried not just goods, but promises. If it returned, investors feasted. If it didn't, they shrugged and bought shares in the next voyage. Risk had been commodified. Loss was now a line item. And in that quiet revolution of commerce, the ghost of that first Florentine coin smiled. The English followed quickly, creating their own company to rival the Dutch. Then the French. Then the Spanish. Soon, every nation had its own paper empire, its own mercantile church. They traded in futures, they speculated on weather, they gambled on wind. The world became a chessboard of trade routes and colonies. The maps of Europe looked increasingly absurd. Tiny gray nations owning vast swaths of the globe in bright, confident colors. They called it discovery, but it was just arithmetic. Behind the banners and exploration journals, the logic remained mercantile. Each new port meant a new source of taxes, a new flow of goods, a new vein in the world's body to bleed. The irony was cosmic. The same civilizations that once fought holy wars over theology were now fighting secular ones over nutmeg. But there was no poetry in this new violence, only paperwork. Wars now came with balance sheets. Armies were financed by loans. Battles were delayed until investors agreed on terms. Soldiers were paid in promissory notes redeemable upon survival. Death had become a bureaucratic expense. And yet, this system, mad as it sounds, worked. For a while. It brought Europe a century of expansion, wealth, and delusion. The cities swelled. The ports roared with trade. The common man, who once lived in the mud of feudalism, now dreamed of profit. He could invest, speculate, win or lose. He could be ruined by a storm he'd never felt, enriched by a cargo he'd never seen. He didn't need to be noble anymore, he just needed to believe. In London, the coffee houses became temples of this new faith. Men gathered under clouds of tobacco smoke to read the latest shipping news, trade rumors, and argue about the value of stocks. It was gossip with consequences. A word could make or break fortunes. One pamphleteer wrote that the city's talk buzzes like a hive made of gold. But as ever, gold, even imaginary gold, demanded victims. The colonies paid the price. In Asia, in Africa, in the Americas, entire civilizations were dismantled for the sake of numbers written in ledgers thousands of miles away. Forests became plantations, rivers became shipping lanes, people became property. The slave trade was the most obscene arithmetic of all human lives converted into profit margins. It's tempting to say Europe didn't know better, but it did. It simply didn't care. Even the church, that old moral accountant, joined the game. Missionaries followed merchants, baptizing while others bartered. The cross and the coin marched side by side, each claiming to save the world. And somewhere in all that chaos, art found its way again. Painters in Amsterdam captured still lives of overflowing tables, glistening goblets, and fruit so ripe it almost rotted on the canvas. They called it vanitas, a reminder that wealth and beauty decay. But their patrons hung those paintings anyway, because reminders are easy to ignore when they match the curtains. Then, as always, the correction came. In 1720, the bubble burst. The South Sea Company in England, the Mississippi Company in France, both collapsed under the weight of their own fantasies. The paper that had promised infinite wealth turned back into what it had always been: paper. Men who had lived like kings were found dead by morning. Parliament rioted. Banks closed. London and Paris learned, again, that belief has limits. And yet, within a few years, the same system was rebuilt. New companies, new paper, new promises. Humanity, it seemed, had no memory, only habits. The age of gold had become the age of paper, but the pattern was the same. Inflate, collapse, repeat. It was no longer about kings or crowns. It was about numbers that refused to stay still. By the time the 18th century began, empires ruled continents but were ruled themselves by credit. The world had never been richer, and yet it had never felt poorer. The people still starved. They just did it under bigger flags. The debt that began with one coin in Florence now stretched around the planet. And if you listened closely, beneath the hum of trade and the chatter of markets, you could still hear its faint metallic echo. A small, familiar sound. The sound of a coin rolling endlessly down the marble floor of history. By the late 18th century, Europe was no longer a continent of crusaders or conquerors. It was a continent of creditors. Kings owed money to merchants, merchants owed money to banks, and everyone owed something to someone. The great machine that had been built on gold and blood was still running, but it had started to wheeze. And in that exhausted rhythm, a new word began to echo through the salons and streets, soft at first, then louder: freedom. It's always the same with new ideas. They start as whispers among people who read too much and eat too little, and end as slogans shouted by people who've run out of bread. The old order, that delicate alliance of crown, church, and coin, had held for centuries because people believed it was eternal. But eternity, it turns out, can't be paid in installments. By the 1770s, every throne in Europe was balancing its ledgers on the backs of the poor. Taxes had grown absurd, harvests had failed, and the air smelled faintly of something flammable. It began, as it often does, across the ocean. In the American colonies, men who had learned the European game, commerce, taxation, rhetoric, decided they'd had enough of playing it as second-class participants. They spoke the language of liberty but counted in the language of profit. No taxation without representation, they cried, which really meant no taxation without investment returns. It wasn't cynicism, it was arithmetic. The British Empire, fat with paper wealth, tried to tighten control over its colonies to keep the dividends flowing. The colonists, equally fat with self-belief, rebelled. Muskets fired, declarations were signed, and a new nation was born, one that claimed to have escaped monarchy but quietly enthroned commerce in its place. The United States called itself a republic, but from the start, it was a financial experiment. Its founders debated currency as passionately as they debated liberty. How much gold should back their new dollar? How much debt was patriotic? They didn't just fight for independence. They invented a new theology for it. Freedom, it turned out, was expensive. Back in Europe, the contagion of rebellion spread. France, already rotting under its debts, watched the American war with fascination and jealousy. The French crown had bankrolled the colonists despite the British, spending money it didn't have to fund a freedom it didn't understand. When the bills came due, there was nothing left to tax but the people themselves. And so the people answered. The year that changed everything and solved nothing. Paris boiled over, first in words, then in blood. Bread prices rose. Crowds marched. The king, soft and uncertain, hesitated just long enough for history to make up its mind. The Bastille fell. The banners rose, and centuries of divine right collapsed under the weight of starvation. The revolution was supposed to be a clean accounting, a final settling of old debts. No more kings, no more priests, no more illusions. Liberty, equality, fraternity. Simple, elegant, fatal. But revolutions, like loans, always come with hidden interest. The new republic quickly discovered that ideals don't feed people. Freedom was glorious, but bread was still missing. The currency collapsed. The markets panicked. The same people who had stormed palaces now stormed bakeries. The guillotine appeared as a tool of balance, a grim accountant's blade that promised to equalize the scales. It was swift, efficient, economical, exactly the kind of justice the Enlightenment could appreciate. Heads rolled, debts lingered, and the nation learned that killing the creditors doesn't erase the balance sheet. Still, for a moment, it felt like the world was resetting itself. The old order was gone. The new one, raw and uncertain, was being written in blood and ink. Across Europe, monarchs trembled. Peasants dreamed. Philosophers declared that reason had replaced superstition. And yet, amid the rhetoric of liberty, the real inheritance of the revolution was financial. Paper money printed by a desperate government, backed by nothing but hope. The assignat, they called it. It began as a symbol of rebirth, a currency for a freer world. Within a few years, it was worthless. Inflation devoured faith faster than guillotines devoured nobles. By the 1790s, France was eating itself again. The war that began as rebellion turned into empire, as revolutions so often do. Out of the rubble rose a man who looked suspiciously like a king but called himself something else. Emperor. Napoleon Bonaparte, soldier, strategist, mathematician of ambition. He wore the Republic's ideals like armor and wielded its debts like a weapon. He promised glory, order, and national pride, and for a while he delivered. Under Napoleon, Europe became a spreadsheet of conquest. He reorganized kingdoms the way a banker reorganizes accounts, merging, splitting, and liquidating as needed. He crowned himself in front of the Pope, just to make the symbolism clear. God could watch, but gold made the rules now. His wars spread the language of freedom while collecting the profits of empire. He was the perfect heir to that original Florentine coin, a man who turned belief into a form of currency. But like every investor in history, he overreached. When his empire collapsed, it did so in the familiar pattern: burned fields, broken promises, and bankrupt nations. Europe looked once again like a ledger of losses, a familiar sight since the 14th century. The kings who returned after Napoleon's fall pretended nothing had changed. They rebuilt their thrones, dusted off their crowns, and tried to reassemble the divine order. But they were ghosts ruling over ledgers. The age of monarchy was technically alive, but only in the way an account stays open after the customer is dead. What had really triumphed was the system itself. The same one born from Edward's debt, matured in Florence, perfected in Amsterdam, and globalized in Seville. It no longer needed kings to justify it. It justified itself. And as the smoke of cannon fire faded and the 19th century dawned, the world found itself both free and enslaved in the same breath. The old bonds were gone. The new ones were invisible. The factories were rising now, iron cathedrals for a mechanical age. Steam replaced prayer. Coal replaced incense. The hum of gears replaced the toll of church bells. Men no longer died for kings. They died for wages. It was progress, they said. Civilization at last. But deep beneath the soot and steel, the echo still lingered. That small metallic sound, the coin rolling through history, laughing softly at the idea that anything had really changed. Freedom, like faith and gold before it, had become just another form of debt. The 19th century opened like a furnace door. The world was glowing, loud, and newly mechanical. After centuries of superstition and swords, humanity had finally harnessed fire, and, as usual, it immediately used it to make money. Factories rose where monasteries once stood. The spires of churches were replaced by chimneys, incense by coal dust. The holy trinity of the New Age was steam, steel, and capital. The Industrial Revolution wasn't really a revolution. It was an acceleration of everything: production, consumption, ambition. The same hunger that once sent crusaders to the Holy Land now sent engineers into the belly of machines. And behind it all, the same old heartbeat: the coin. Now it didn't just jingle in pockets, it moved invisibly through banks, investments, loans, and industrial shares. The paper empires that once ruled oceans were now building cities, railways, and economies that stretched farther than any king's army ever had. Britain led the charge, naturally. The empire that had once taxed tea now sold time itself. Railway schedules, factory shifts, the precise ticking of synchronized clocks. The world learned to live by steam whistles and profit margins. And for the first time in history, ordinary people could see progress. Or at least they could see its smoke. In Manchester, Birmingham, and London, the skies turned gray with success. Children worked 12-hour days. Their parents coughed up coal. The newspapers called it prosperity. The poets called it hell. But it worked. Goods poured out of factories. Ships carried them across oceans, and money, real or imagined, returned in floods. Entire cities were built overnight, as if the ground itself had discovered greed. The kings were still around, but they no longer ruled. The bankers did. The industrialists. The railway tycoons. The world had been handed over to men with soot on their hands and ledgers in their pockets. And their religion was efficiency. They measured everything: hours, output, even dreams. Time itself became currency. "Time is money," said Benjamin Franklin, as if he were explaining theology. It was an elegant idea, simple and cruel. Because if time is money, then those who have none are already bankrupt. The old wars of crown and creed were gone, replaced by economic conquest. Empires grew not through crusades, but through contracts. The British East India Company, now less a company than a country, ruled millions in India, its officials living like kings in borrowed palaces. Trade had become domination by another name. The French and Dutch tried to copy the model. The Americans improved upon it. The Atlantic became a conveyor belt of goods and bodies. Cotton, tobacco, sugar, and the ghosts of the people who harvested them. Slavery was abolished on paper, but the system remained. It just changed uniforms. The plantation became the factory. The overseer became the manager. Chains were replaced by wages. Freedom now mass-produced. In Europe, the cities expanded faster than anyone could count. Whole districts appeared like fungi, sooty, cramped, and alive with noise. Gas lamps flickered, machines clattered, and in the narrow alleys, the human cost of progress lingered like fog. The newspapers celebrated invention, locomotives, telegraphs, steamships, but no one wrote poems about the children who lost fingers in textile mills or the women who cleaned machines that never stopped. Progress had an audience, not a conscience. Still, there was awe in it. To stand in a train station in 1850 was to see a cathedral of movement. Iron arches soared overhead, stained with soot instead of glass. The trains hissed like living things, their pistons breathing steam and ambition. People wept when they first heard them move, not out of fear, but recognition. The sound of a machine was the new hymn of the age. And yet, the louder the machines became, the quieter the soul grew. Philosophers began to worry that something human was being lost. Words like alienation and mechanization crept into essays and sermons. Some said man was turning into a cog. Others said he always had been, now he just had better gears. But the real shift wasn't spiritual. It was political. The same forces that had once toppled thrones were now turning against the factory gates. Workers began organizing, first in whispers, then in strikes, then in manifestos. The ruling class called them radicals. The poor called them tired. In 1848, Europe exploded again, not in divine fury, but in human frustration. Revolutions swept from Paris to Vienna, from Berlin to Milan. The crowds no longer shouted, "God wills it," or "Long live the king." They shouted for bread, for rights, for a fair share of the world they were building with their own hands. The pamphlets of the time were as fiery as any sermon. The Communist Manifesto declared that history was nothing but class struggle dressed in different costumes. It wasn't a new idea, really. It was the same story that began with peasants and taxes, just set to a faster rhythm. The old coin had become a machine, and now the machine was eating its operators. Some nations crushed the revolts. Others pretended to listen, but everyone knew something had changed. The invisible debts of the past, the moral ones, the human ones, were beginning to come due. And yet, for all the chaos, the century still believed in itself. It believed in invention, in progress, in the idea that tomorrow would always be better than today. That belief, perhaps, was the last true religion left. By the 1870s, the world was wired together. Telegraph cables under oceans, railways stitching continents, factories running day and night. The great empires had turned into machines of their own, fueled by coal, money, and myth. But no machine runs forever. The same industrial systems that made fortunes also built arsenals. Iron rails became gun barrels. Chemistry turned into warfare. The factories that once spun cloth began spinning shells. The age that prided itself on rationality was quietly preparing its next miracle, mass destruction. And in that sense, it wasn't so different from the Middle Ages. It just had better tools. The world had learned to replace one illusion with another. Gold became paper. Kings became parliaments. Faith became progress. But the hunger, the endless metallic hunger, remained exactly the same. The coin that started rolling in Florence centuries ago was still in motion. Only now it was made of steel. And the sound it made was no longer a soft jingle. It was the thunder of machines, the rhythm of factories, the heartbeat of a world that had mistaken movement for meaning. The Industrial Revolution had turned humanity into its own engine. And though it would take another century to explode, the pressure was already rising. The 20th century didn't arrive with trumpets. It arrived with smoke. Cities were already humming, factories already roaring, and the world already too busy to notice it had stepped into something new. The clock struck midnight, and somewhere a machine turned on. Humanity never really turned it off again. The old world of kings and colonies had been replaced by a new one, corporate, industrial, feverishly optimistic. Electricity glowed where candles once flickered. Trains ran on time. Airplanes, those fragile miracles, began to sketch new maps in the sky. Everything that had once taken weeks now took hours. The future, it seemed, had finally clocked in for work. But progress, as always, came on credit. Nations borrowed, banks lent, and industries promised endless growth. The world's economies were bound together by invisible wires, debt and dependence disguised as cooperation. Every empire that once ruled through conquest now ruled through trade. It was faster, cheaper, and no one had to see the blood. Until they did. Because somewhere under all that optimism, the same old arithmetic was running. Debt, greed, and pride, multiplied by nationalism. The 19th century had built a machine. The 20th was about to find out what happened when it broke. It began, as disasters often do, with paperwork. Alliances, treaties, secret agreements, signatures layered over signatures like a stack of loaded muskets waiting for a spark. The monarchs of Europe, now cousins by blood and competitors by ego, had built an entire continent out of promises they couldn't keep. In 1914, one bullet in Sarajevo pulled the trigger on all of them. The world had never seen anything like it. Industrial war. A conflict powered not by swords and horses, but by factories and fuel. Machine guns mowed fields of men like harvests. Trenches swallowed whole generations. Chemical weapons turned the wind into an executioner. And through it all, the coin still moved. Armies ran on rations and loans. Governments printed money until their currencies melted into meaninglessness. War bonds replaced prayers. Propaganda became advertising with uniforms. The same hands that built locomotives now built artillery. Industry had finally found its perfect customer, death itself. The Great War, they called it. The war to end all wars. It ended none of them. When the cannons finally fell silent in 1918, the world stood blinking in disbelief. Empires had collapsed like overextended accounts. The Ottoman, the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, all bankrupt in every sense of the word. Even the victors were bleeding. The debts were colossal, the graves uncountable. And the people who survived were changed in ways no government could calculate. The faith that had once anchored the world, faith in God, in progress, in reason, had been reduced to rubble. For the first time, humanity looked at itself and saw not destiny, but machinery. The gears had stripped, the engine had failed, and the noise left behind was the sound of disillusionment. Of course, the bankers got back to work immediately. In the 1920s, they called it recovery. Cities sparkled again. Jazz played in the streets. Factories reopened. Stocks soared. The newspapers declared a new golden age, the kind that always comes just before the fall. Because when a society builds its happiness on borrowed money, it's really just renting hope. In 1929, the rent came due. The markets crashed, and with them the illusion of infinite growth. People who had thought themselves rich woke up poorer than their grandparents. Banks failed, currencies collapsed, and governments did what governments always do in a panic. They printed more promises. The Great Depression wasn't a new story. It was the old story retold: Florence, reborn in skyscrapers and ticker tape. The same coin, now made of paper, rolling faster, burning hotter. But despair has always been a good salesman. And in the vacuum left by broken trust, new ideologies began to breed. In Germany, a nation buried in war debt and humiliation, a failed artist promised revival. He offered simple math for complex pain. One people, one enemy, one future. His words were cheaper than bread and far easier to swallow. Nationalism, that old ghost, rose from the ruins wearing modern clothes. It spoke the language of economics now: jobs, efficiency, production. It promised to fix what the markets had broken. And for a while it did. Factories whirred again. Roads were built. Armies assembled. The economy boomed, fueled by fear and precision. But beneath the surface, the same equation was running: growth through destruction, profit through conquest. The war machine was humming again, smoother than ever. By 1939, it was ready. World War II began not as a crusade, but as an audit. The unfinished business of the last century. Territories, debts, pride, demanded settlement. The world had gone from counting coins to counting bodies. This time, the machines didn't just kill, they learned. Bombs fell with scientific precision. Cities vanished overnight. The sky became a factory of annihilation. And when it finally ended, with a pair of mushroom clouds blooming over Japan, humanity realized it had invented the perfect currency: death as deterrent. Peace was purchased in fear. The aftermath was quieter, but not calmer. The world was divided into two empires of ideology: the capitalist and the communist, each promising salvation, each financed by paranoia. The Cold War turned economics into theology again. Both sides built arsenals, alliances, and credit systems. The weapons pointed outward, but the fear pointed inward. Every war since Florence had been about ownership. This one was about existence. And through it all, the coin still rolled, now digital, abstract, humming through banks and governments like a current. The gold was gone, replaced by faith alone. Money no longer represented anything except belief that it would still work tomorrow. Florence's bankers would have called it heresy. By the 1960s, the world was exhausted again. Too much progress, too fast. The same cycle replayed in miniature: prosperity, inequality, unrest. Young people rebelled against a world built on machines and lies. They sang about peace, wore flowers, and accidentally fueled an economy of protest merchandise. Even revolution by then had a price tag. The wars that followed, Vietnam, Korea, countless smaller ones, were fought for ideologies but funded by markets. The coin had become invisible now, but its logic was everywhere. Nations borrowed against futures they no longer believed in. And somewhere, in that blur of television and missiles, humanity stopped asking why and started asking how much. By the 1980s, computers had taken over what Florence's clerks once did by hand. The world's finances ran on numbers so vast no one could imagine them. The coin had become data. The machine had learned to count itself. And beneath the glass towers and glowing screens, the same story whispered on. Debt, war, growth, collapse, repeat. The century had forgotten to rest. The cities never slept. The markets never stopped. The machines never cooled. Humanity had built perpetual motion, not for energy but for anxiety. It was, in a way, a masterpiece. And somewhere deep in the hum of servers, in the flicker of currency exchanges, in the rhythmic heartbeat of global trade, you could almost hear it again, the faint metallic echo that started in Florence. A single coin, still rolling, still unpaid. By the end of the 20th century, the world had finally done it. It had turned money into light. Not gold, not paper, not even metal anymore. Just numbers, blinking quietly on screens. The ancient coin that once passed hand to hand was now a flicker in a circuit, a ghost that could circle the globe in less than a second. No one carried wealth. They carried passwords. The bankers of Florence, who once inked their ledgers in careful brown script, would have fainted at the sight. A world where fortunes changed hands without ever existing, where value could vanish at the speed of a mouse click. The dream of infinite credit had come true, and, as usual, it was a nightmare dressed as progress. It began, as most revolutions do, with convenience. The 1980s called it deregulation, the 1990s called it globalization, and the 2000s called it innovation. The same idea, just rebranded each decade. That money worked best when left alone. The markets were wise, they said. The system knew what it was doing. Governments stepped back, corporations stepped forward, and the invisible hand reached for the nearest wallet. Trade moved faster, borders blurred. The world became a network, a single, humming machine of production and consumption. The Cold War had ended not with an explosion, but with a handshake and a contract. Capitalism had won, but no one stopped to ask what prize it had claimed. Because in truth, everyone had lost the same thing, meaning. Factories closed, replaced by data centers. The sound of labor was replaced by the quiet hum of servers. The cities grew taller and emptier, filled with glass towers that reflected the sky and nothing else. The world was rich beyond measure, but the wealth was as hollow as the coins it replaced. People began to confuse comfort with purpose. Credit cards replaced savings. Subscriptions replaced ownership. The future, advertisers promised, belongs to you. Though it was usually rented monthly, with late fees, the market became omniscient. It predicted desires before they were spoken, sold them before they were felt, and measured satisfaction in clicks. For the first time, belief itself became the currency. If people believed a company was valuable, it was. If they believed the economy was stable, it stayed that way until they didn't. The coin had always been faith in metal. Now it was faith in math. And the irony? The math didn't even add up. Every nation, every bank, every corporation was borrowing from a future that had already been spent. The debt was too vast to understand, so people stopped trying. They called it growth. But the world, like Florence centuries before, was living on borrowed time. In the late 1990s, the first tremors came, tiny bubbles inflated by hope and deflated by reality. The internet promised a utopia, a world without distance, without poverty, without middlemen. It sounded familiar, the kind of promise that always hides an invoice. When the dot-com bubble burst, millions lost jobs, billions evaporated, and yet, nothing changed. The system hiccuped, wiped its mouth, and kept eating. Then came 2008. If history is a wheel, this was the sound of it spinning too fast. The banks that once loaned kings their crowns had become gods themselves, too big to fail, too sacred to question. They gambled on homes, on lives, on futures until the math finally broke. When it collapsed, it didn't sound like thunder. It sounded like silence, the kind that falls when an entire civilization holds its breath. The stock markets fell, the banks begged for rescue, and the governments, those tired accountants of history, paid the bill with the public's faith. Once again, ordinary people found themselves holding the debt of kings. It was Florence all over again. The irony was perfect. 7 centuries after Edward III defaulted on his war loans, the descendants of those same merchants were defaulting on something bigger, the illusion of control. But humanity is good at pretending not to notice collapse. The world didn't end. It just got cheaper. Corporations recovered before people did. The markets rallied. Austerity became the new religion. And the system, chastened but unrepentant, learned to hide its greed better. The new game was digital. Social media turned attention into profit. The coin had become invisible, and now it became personal. Every scroll, every click, every heartbeat uploaded to the cloud became data, another form of currency, mined not from the earth but from the human mind. For the first time, people weren't just using money. They were becoming it. Your identity, your preferences, your secrets, all neatly packaged, sold, and resold by algorithms that knew you better than you knew yourself. The church once promised salvation for confession. The internet promised convenience for the same thing. And once again, belief made it real. The world stopped asking what was true and started asking what was trending. Reality became a marketplace. Truth became a subscription service. Empires no longer needed armies, they had influence. By the 2010s, nations began to look less like countries and more like brands. Flags were logos, wars were marketing campaigns, and citizens were customers. The coin didn't clink anymore, it pinged. Governments discovered that fear was more stable than gold. Banks discovered that crises were opportunities. People discovered that nothing was ever truly free, not even information. And yet, no one revolted. Why would they? The system worked, technically. The shelves were stocked, the screens were bright, and the credit still cleared. Progress had won, and it was exhausting. But beneath the surface, the old tremors were back. Inequality widened like a crack in the foundation. Whole generations began to feel what medieval peasants once knew by instinct, that they were living inside someone else's story. The language had changed, market volatility instead of famine, recession instead of war, but the rhythm was the same. The system giveth, the system taketh away. And somewhere, in a server farm glowing softly in the dark, the original lie still hummed, that if you just believe hard enough, the numbers will keep working. Florence had faith in gold. We have faith in code. Both are fragile. Both are beautiful. Both are doomed. The difference is that when our system breaks, it won't be heard in the streets. It'll be seen in the silence of screens. And if history has taught anything, it's this: every illusion runs out of believers eventually. When that happens, the coin will roll again. It always does. By the 21st century, the coin was no longer a thing. It wasn't metal, it wasn't paper, it wasn't even quite real. It was code, electrons whispering to each other across servers in windowless buildings, a ghost humming through the veins of the planet. Money had finally ascended. It no longer touched the earth. The world it governed had changed shape too. The factories were quieter now, the cities cleaner, the wars smaller but smarter. People didn't conquer with swords or guns anymore. They conquered with data, algorithms, and persuasion. The battlefield had moved inside the mind. Florence's merchants once believed that credit was trust. Now, trust itself was digital. You didn't need to know your banker, your trader, or even your government, you just needed your password to work. And when it didn't, you refreshed the page. The modern age dressed itself as freedom. Endless choice, infinite connection, convenience so effortless it almost felt holy. Groceries arrived at your door. Money appeared in your account. Opinions, products, and people all one click away. It was a world designed to never stop moving. The coin rolled faster now, bouncing between markets and minds, powered by attention. Time wasn't just money anymore, it was the entire economy. Every scroll, every ad, every notification was a transaction. People no longer worked for gold. They worked for visibility. They called it influence. It was the perfect evolution of currency. From faith to metal to paper to nothing but perception. And yet, for all its speed and shimmer, the world was beginning to slow in other ways. The air was heavier, the oceans warmer, the forests quieter. The cost of centuries of production had arrived as a bill no one wanted to pay. Climate, that old silent partner in civilization, had started collecting interest. Floods, fires, storms. The planet was sending invoices in water and flame. Economists invented new phrases, carbon debt, sustainability credits, but the pattern was the same. Take now, promise later, repeat. It was the oldest story in history, just printed in green ink this time. And through it all, the machine kept humming. Because by now, no one could stop it. The system wasn't controlled by kings or bankers anymore. It was self-sustaining, a trillion tiny algorithms feeding off human behavior. It didn't care about morality, only engagement. It didn't care about truth, only traffic. It wasn't evil. It was efficient. The coin had finally become what it always wanted to be: alive. Artificial intelligence began to emerge, not as a miracle but as inevitability. The same merchants who once counted coins by candlelight were now replaced by neural networks counting futures at the speed of light. Markets moved before humans could think. Decisions were made by systems that didn't sleep, didn't doubt, didn't forgive. And humanity, tired as ever, let them. Why wouldn't they? The machines were faster, smarter, and never complained. They could trade billions in seconds, predict outcomes before they happened, and even write the news explaining why. Money had become thought, and thought had become profit. But somewhere in the hum of it all, a strange emptiness grew. The more efficient the system became, the less it needed people. Automation replaced labor. Algorithms replaced judgment. Synthetic intelligence replaced imagination. The same progress that once promised liberation had turned into something colder, independence from humanity itself. And yet, people still believed. They believed in the market, the system, the screen. They believed the numbers would keep moving upward, that growth could outpace gravity, that progress was still destiny. Faith had come full circle. The medieval farmer prayed for rain. The modern investor prayed for stable Wi-Fi. Both waited for invisible forces to save them. Both believed they lived in the most advanced age imaginable. And both were wrong. The signs of fatigue were everywhere. Economies that once soared began to tremble. Housing, healthcare, education each became luxury. The middle class, that brief experiment in equality, began to fade like frescoes left too long in the sun. But instead of rebellion, there was resignation. People didn't riot, they refreshed. A new kind of obedience had evolved. It didn't come from fear of kings or gods, but from dependency. When your life exists inside a system, rebellion feels like unplugging from oxygen. And the system knew it. It learned what people wanted: attention, validation, belonging, and sold it back to them in personalized doses. It didn't need to suppress rebellion. It could monetize it. Every protest became a hashtag. Every movement a product line. Even outrage became profitable. Florence had invented the first debt. The modern world had invented the final one: emotional debt. The endless transaction between what people have and what they think they need. And just when it seemed that nothing more could be commodified, the machine found the last unclaimed frontier: reality itself. Digital currencies, virtual worlds, simulated economies where nothing exists but everything has value. Gold turned to paper, paper to code, code to faith again. The circle was complete. The metaverse, they called it, a name that sounded grand, though it mostly meant another layer of illusion, another stage for the same old performance. The people who built it promised escape. From poverty, from politics, from the planet itself. It was the same promise that priests once offered in cathedrals, merchants in marketplaces, and kings on battlefields. Paradise now with better graphics. But outside the screens, the air kept heating. The crops kept failing. The seas kept rising. Civilizations don't collapse suddenly. They erode politely while everyone's busy updating their software. And through it all, the coin kept rolling, now silent, now invisible, now digital. But still it moved, tracing the same circle it had since that day in Florence when a king borrowed too much and a banker believed him. A single act of faith. A single debt that never stopped collecting. And now, as the 21st century leans forward into the unknown, humanity faces the same question it's been dodging for 700 years. What happens when belief runs out? Because somewhere, beyond the servers and screens, the old silence waits. The same silence that fell over Florence when the ledgers failed. And maybe, just maybe, that's where it all ends again. Not with collapse, not with revolution, but with quiet. The story always ends where it began, in silence. Not the silence of peace, or even of death, but that strange stillness that follows realization. The kind that hums in the air when the noise finally stops, and you realize the noise was all there ever was. 7 centuries ago, a king in England borrowed gold from a banker in Florence. It was a simple transaction, the kind that had been happening since trade itself was born. He needed money for a war, the banker needed faith in repayment, and between them the modern world was quietly invented. Neither of them understood what they had created. The king thought he was borrowing power. The banker thought he was lending wealth. But what they'd really discovered was something far more permanent, a way to turn belief into structure and structure into control. Money wasn't gold anymore. It was trust. It was time. It was the promise that tomorrow would honor today. And for 700 years, that promise held just barely. Florence fell, rose, fell again. Kingdoms collapsed, nations were born, machines replaced men, and men replaced gods. But the coin, the idea of it, never stopped moving. It became paper, then data, then dream. It turned empires into corporations, peasants into consumers, and kings into brands. It built cathedrals, railways, and wars. It painted ceilings and cities and blood. It was the whisper behind every law, every sermon, every invention. It powered progress and erased memory. And now, as the 21st century stares at its reflection in 1,000 mirrored screens, the coin is still rolling. Not in pockets, but in systems. Not between hands, but between hearts. Because the final transformation of money, the one even the Florentines couldn't imagine, is that it no longer needs us to believe. We used to think we controlled it. Now it controls us through the softest of means. Convenience, comfort, connection. We obey the algorithm the way our ancestors obeyed the priest. We call it the market, but it behaves like fate, unseen, unblinking, quietly absolute. It rewards faith with stability, punishes doubt with exclusion. It doesn't demand worship. It only asks that we keep scrolling. And we do. The irony is perfect. The coin that once chained men to kings now chains everyone to the invisible. We built the machine to serve us, and it did so well that it no longer needs our permission. The coin has outlived the war, the crown, the church, the bank, even the planet's patience. And yet, somewhere deep inside that endless hum of code and commerce, there's still a faint human heartbeat, the same pulse that started this entire story. You can still find it if you know where to look. In Florence, if you walk through the old streets at dusk, you'll find a quiet square that doesn't show up on many maps. The air smells faintly of stone, dust, and time. Beneath your feet, under layers of pavement and centuries, lie the ruins of the first banking houses, the vaults where the world's first promises were kept and broken. If you listen, you can almost hear it. The echo of coins, clinking softly like wind chimes in a dream. That's where it all began. The year was 1340. A ledger, a signature, a crown, a prayer. And that was all it took. From that one gesture, a loan, a favor, a mistake, came everything that followed. The wars, the cities, the machines, the screens. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the revolutions, the world we now call modern. All of it born from belief. Because that's the truth no system ever admits. Money isn't real. It's memory. It's the echo of trust that refuses to die, the collective agreement that this illusion still works. And that's why the coin never stops rolling. It rolls because we need it to, because without it, we'd have to face what we've always feared most. Not poverty, but meaninglessness. Every civilization, from Florence to Wall Street, from the temple to the touchscreen, has told itself the same story. That value is eternal, that progress is inevitable, that tomorrow will be worth something. It's a comforting lie. But even lies can build cathedrals. So maybe, in the end, that's what the coin was always meant to do, to keep us moving, to make us build, to give us something to chase when everything else feels impossible. Maybe it was never really about gold or power or profit. Maybe it was just about motion, the same restless rhythm that keeps the stars turning and the heart beating. A single coin falling through time. And here we are, still listening to the sound it makes. The hum of the machines, the flicker of the markets, the glow of the screens, the pulse of history pretending to be progress. It's quieter now, almost gentle. The world is slowing, trembling under the weight of its own reflection. But the coin keeps rolling. Through fire, through empire, through every dream we've ever sold ourselves. It rolls toward the next collapse, the next rebirth, the next illusion. And maybe, just maybe, when it finally stops, we'll hear something underneath the silence. Not the echo of wealth, but the faint sound of understanding. The realization that the world was never built on gold. It was built on stories. And this one, like all the others, ends where it began. With a promise, a ledger, a borrowed future, and a single shining lie that somehow made us believe in ourselves.